Hello and welcome back to the building of the Svensson Junkmeister. It's the intention of this video to show you how I go about painting up figures for my models. In this case it happens to be pilots for this build, but in the past it's been figures for model railways and for boats. I think it's important that in any vehicle which is driven by somebody that you have a representation of a person. There's nothing strikes me as more ludicrous than seeing a model locomotive or a model aircraft flying through the air without a pilot in the seat. I know some people just don't care about that, or they're put off by how the pilots look and it spoils the model. So what I intend doing here is showing you how I go about painting them up. Before we do that, a little update on the engine installation. As you can see, it's all ready to try out. That's the ignition battery there. I've put a spinner on it, at least initially, because if I have to resort to a starter, electric starter, that makes life a lot easier. And I'll do a separate video on that for you to see. But back to the matter in hand. If I show you these figures, these splendid chaps were printed for me by a fellow club member, Bob, from the Nissan Indoor Group. I was rather stuck trying to get a 1/4 scale figure for this model. It's a big model of a small plane basically, and the 1/4 scale figures that I could source were just ludicrously expensive, in my view anyway, to the budget I was prepared to spend. But Bob came to the rescue and he said, "Oh, I can easily print you pilots up to whichever scale you want." And he duly did this, and he came up with these two chaps. This one is a sort of generic pilot that many of you might have seen, 3D printed. I don't know the technicalities of the material that was used, but Bob assured me that these were free because in total they cost about 50p of material, which was very kind of him. That's a sort of generic pilot that I've seen before in different scales. This one's interesting, partly because there's a lot of face showing, and that means that you have to be careful on how you go about that, and I'll show how I approach that in this video. But the interesting thing is that that's actually JFK's head. Bob very cleverly spliced it from one computer program and added it to another. So that's the former American president there, complete with pilot's outfit. And depending on how these turn out, I'll be adding one of them to the cockpit. If I just show you how they sort of fit in, I'm thinking, looking at photographs, that we need them sat about that height, in which the scale has worked out perfectly in my view. So let's crack on. I'll pause it here and we'll get set and ready to start painting these. It's time to crack on and get these figures painted for the Junkmeister. The first thing I'm going to do is say that there's more than one way to actually paint figures. And I personally use more than one technique depending on what I want to achieve. In this case, I'll start with this one first. This one is a slightly different approach because there's far more flesh showing, and I'll concentrate more there on how to blend flesh colours. But in the case of this one, it's about creating depth in the figure painting. And to do that, I aim for three things, or three layers of colour. There's a base colour, there's highlights, and then there's lowlights. And creating that depth comes from a combination of techniques, including using washes, dry brushing, and using edge shadows, which I'll demonstrate in the process of painting this. The first thing you'll notice that I've done is I've given the 3D print a flash spray of primer, and that's basically for two reasons. One, it highlights anything that needs doing to the model. And in this case, but the nature of 3D printing is it's in layers, and it's apparent to me that some of these layers are showing up not really everywhere. It's the only place it's really apparent to me is on the top of the pilot's cap, and because that's something you're going to look down on, I'm going to need to address that. And the other reason for applying a flash coat is it gives some tooth for the paint to grip to. The only thing that I have done, you'll notice, I've masked off the face, and the reason for that is when I'm trying to create fresh tones, you want light colours to shine through, and if I put a dark grey on, that will make it more difficult in this case. You can actually achieve good flesh tones by putting a very dark colour on almost a black and then using layered dry brush techniques, but that's not what I'm going to do with this one. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sand this out and see how much comes out. I may actually add some filler to it to take out those fine lines, but the bulk of the rest of it I can live with. Those little lines that are created by the layering technique just look like a part of the leather jacket that he's wearing, so that's not a big deal, apart from this part at the top. So I'm going to take them off the plinth and I'm going to sand those out, and then I think I'll give it another flash of primer and see what it looks like. So the only thing that's really caught my eye on this print is that part there, and that wasn't really apparent until I added the primer. That's coming out quite nicely. When I'm handling these, what's obvious is how lightweight they are. 3D printing like this has enormous potential for obviously model aircraft where weight is your enemy. That's the only bit that's pretty obvious. So what I'll do now is I'll give that another flash coat, and then we'll actually start the painting proper. I'll pause here. I'm happy with that now. I've removed the obvious circular lines produced by the print, and we're ready to actually start painting. I'll remove this mask. We don't need that anymore. Immediately you start to get more of a feel for it, even just that, I think. We'll come back to this area in a second. Now, the scarf and the fur lining on the jacket stands out 3D form above the jacket, and that means that I'm going to start with that first. It's easier this way because there will be a degree of overpainting which will occur because of the technique I'm using onto the jacket here. It's easier to do this first. Any overpainting that occurs here can be blocked out when I come to do that. So, what am I going to do? First of all, what am I using? I'm not particular about brands or makes or even mediums that I use with paints. These happen to be a variety here. I have some Vallejo, which are actually excellent paints. That one's Vallejo and that one is. They're all Vallejo, but I also have some from the craft shop which cost a fraction of the amount but achieve basically the same result. All of these are acrylic based, which gives you a plastic type finish. I may use enamel paint. I may even use oils. They all have different properties. The acrylics dry much quicker, which for impatient modelers, perhaps that's the way to go. The other thing that you'll notice here is that I've got 3 different tones. There's the lightest tone, which is pure white. There's a darker tone here, and then there's a step in between. And when it comes to painting, I'm going to try and use this technique. The dark tones, lighter tones, highlights, and I'll combine these together to produce the effect that I'm wanting with the scarf. I need to get myself a painting palette, and for that I'm going to use a plate. Just bear with me while I get it one. Pause it for a second. White plates like this are ideal because they show the true colour through because of the white reflective surface. For the brushes, I got these from a craft store, and there's a variety of different types, and for the technique that I'm going to use, the flats and the half rounds, these are the most useful. I'm going to start off with this one, this flat. It's actually a chisel, but a straight flat would do the same job. And we'll start off by just getting some of this paint down on my makeshift palette. Some white. That needs shaking. Some of the sort of dirty beige, and then the lighter beige. Same there. Should have shook it first, Mark. Okay, I'm going to put this on time lapse. All I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the darkest colour first onto the scarf and the wool lining on the inside of the jacket. That base colour has now been applied, and what I'm going to do now is paint over the top a wash, and in this case I'm going to use an acrylic ink. You can buy wash colours for plastic modelling. If you go to any model shop, they'll have washes, and this is how I tend to use them. I'm going to flood it on, and what will happen is it'll collect in all the hollows on this surface, and then if need be I'll use one of these sponges. It's makeup sponge. I don't go in and at the shop and buy it, although why I shouldn't I don't know. My daughter buys them for me, and I'll use that to dab off from the surface, leaving the dark colour underneath. So I'm actually adding a bit of water to this ink because I want it quite thin. And you'll see that it starts to form in the hollows. And I think you'll probably also see why I'm doing this bit first, because it sort of splurges onto the layer below. I'm trying to pick out the texture of this wonderful 3D printing process done for me by Bob and his computer wizardry. It's not my strength, computer work. I'm very much a tabletop modeler, but I'm applying the wash here. And I hope you can see the way we're getting some depth to that straight away, because it's lying in all the hollows and the creases, which is what I want. And I'm going to dry this now, see what it looks like. I don't think I need to dab any off actually. And then we'll go to the next phase. I've just discovered there that 3D printing, or at least this material, doesn't like heat, began to sag. So you need to be careful with that. That's dry now, and you can see some of the depth has already been produced on the scarf and this area. I'm going to distinguish between the two at some stage, you'll see in a moment. I'm now going to use a technique that's called dry brushing, and you really do need a flat or a chisel brush for this to work. And as the name implies, you pick the paint up, and I'm going to pick the next shade down. So in this case it's this one. I'm going to apply it to the brush, and then I'm going to take this piece of tissue and take quite a lot of it off, so it's only the hint of it. And then what you do is you just lightly go over the surface. And you need to do this lightly in more than one pass. You won't get it in one go. And I'm dragging it across the surface with the flat of the brush. And by doing that, I'm picking out the highlights of the surface. And you won't get it, you definitely won't get it in one go. See, it's starting to form here. You really need to leave it to dry a little bit. I'm sort of brushing a little bit to demonstrate, but and I'm emphasising it more on the edges because that's where the light would hit. Light tends to hit edges, and where there's folds and recesses, that's where you get the shadows. So very lightly going over the surface. Using the flat of the brush to achieve this. Maybe a lot of people aren't really fussed about going to this extent, but I personally think it's worthwhile. But that's just me. I'll let that dry. I'm a little bit cautious about using the hairdryer on it now. That's gone hard again, but it clearly does respond to heat. So I'll have to pause it. And then when it's dry, we'll come back and we'll go over it again with a slightly lighter shade. I'll leave that there, we'll come back, build it up, and then I'll show you what happens as the lighter shades are added. Once the base coat has been applied, you can see here what I'm doing is I'm painting a much darker shade, almost a black, into all the creases, and that allows the 3D shape to start to stand out. That's stage 2, and the next thing that you'll see me do, I'm going to apply, once I've finished touching these little bits up, a much lighter coat or lighter tone of the colour on all the parts which are raised up, and that creates the depth that we're looking for in this approach. And you can see here that I'm applying a much lighter coat along the edge of the jacket, the point at which the light would catch it. We'll fast forward a little bit so you can see the final product, but basically it all sort of jumps out once you start doing this. Here I'm applying a dry brush leather colour over the whole of the fabric, the helmet and the jacket, and as you can see, you now get a lot of depth in the actual model itself.